I caught her red-handed, hunched over my mailbox like a raccoon with a vendetta. "Hey!" I shouted as I jogged up the driveway, grocery bags swinging from my arms. "What the hell are you doing?" Evelyn Oakley, vice president of our HOA and self-appointed neighborhood dictator, snapped upright like a guilty kid with cookie crumbs on her blouse. "Oh, Trevor, I was just checking if your mailbox was compliant." "New guidelines about rust and cut the crap, Evelyn," I said, dropping the bags on my porch. "You opened my mail." The envelope in her hand wasn't hers. It had my name, Trevor Nolan, printed across the front in bold. She tried to slide it back into the box, but I was already at her side. "That's a federal offense," I said, snatching it from her. "You know that, right?" Her lips pinched. "If you didn't keep violating the HOA codes, I wouldn't have to take matters into my own hands." I stared at her. "So you admit it," she crossed her arms and huffed like a toddler. "You've had an unauthorized garden gnome in your front yard for 3 weeks, and a wind chime. That's 2 violations. And based on your mail, which, by the way, was already hanging halfway out, I saw a receipt that confirms you ordered a lawn flamingo. That's 3. I laughed. "You went through my mail to find out what I bought online." She tilted her head like she was doing the world a favor. "If you just followed the rules, Trevor, I wouldn't have to enforce them." That was the last straw. This woman had been on my back since I moved in 2 years ago. I'd tolerated the passive-aggressive notes on my door, the surprise inspections, even the time she tried to fine me for parking 1 inch over the sidewalk. But this was a felony. I didn't argue. I walked inside, placed the tampered envelope on my kitchen table, and called the USPS inspection service. The guy on the phone didn't sound surprised. "You said she's part of the HOA, Vice President," I said. "Typical," he muttered. "We'll send someone." 3 days later, a black SUV rolled into our cul-de-sac. 2 federal inspectors stepped out, badges visible, sharp suits, no nonsense. I was working on my porch light when they knocked on Evelyn's door. She opened it in her usual pastel sweater set. From where I stood, I saw her smile melt the moment they flashed their credentials. "What's this about?" she asked, voice suddenly unsure. "We have reason to believe you've been tampering with private mail," one of them said, calm but direct. "Excuse me," she gasped. "That's outrageous." "I'm the vice president of this community." "And that gives you the right to open residents' mail?" the younger agent asked. I mean, it was sticking out. They didn't buy it. They stepped inside. The door closed behind them. I leaned against my porch post and watched the show. I wasn't the only one. By the time they left, 30 minutes later, Evelyn's face was the color of wet concrete, and she wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Then came the kicker. The next morning, every resident got a notice from the HOA board. Due to recent events and pending investigations, Evelyn Oakley will be on administrative leave from her HOA duties until further notice. I guess opening my mail over a lawn flamingo wasn't worth it after all. The neighborhood was quieter than I'd ever heard it. No leaf blowers, no barking dogs, not even the usual hum of conversation. Just the occasional squeak of a sprinkler head or the faint clink of wind chimes someone else's, not mine anymore. People walked slower past Evelyn's house now, pretending not to look while absolutely looking. I didn't say anything to my neighbors. I didn't need to. Word had spread fast. Not because I'd told anyone, but because the federal agents had walked in wearing suits and walked out with a sealed evidence bag. That speaks louder than gossip. On the 4th day after Evelyn's leave, a new face appeared at the HOA bulletin board on the corner by the park. His name was Martin Rivas, interim president. I recognized him vaguely, a quiet guy who lived on Sycamore Lane, 2 blocks over. He posted a letter announcing that all board activity was paused pending an internal audit. That got my attention. HOAs don't pause anything unless they have to. At sunset, I saw Martin walking alone with a clipboard, stopping every few houses to jot something down. When he reached my driveway, I met him halfway. "Evening," he said, adjusting his glasses. "You replacing Evelyn permanently?" I asked. He chuckled softly. No, thank God, just holding things together till we get through this mess. He looked over his shoulder before continuing. Look, he said, lowering his voice. Off the record. If you've got anything else, documents, dates, anything, now's the time. We're bringing in an outside investigator. She left more behind than anyone realized. I didn't hesitate. Give me your email. I spent the rest of the night digging through the folder I'd started keeping the month I moved in. I'd called it neighborhood nonsense back then. Now it was evidence. I forwarded him scanned copies of every note Evelyn had left taped to my door, every fine notice without a signature, every reminder that didn't cite an actual bylaw. But the real gold came from a thumb drive I hadn't touched in over a year, security footage. I'd installed the cameras after a potted plant went missing from my porch. Never caught the thief, but the drive had weeks of footage saved. I combed through late nights and early mornings, fast-forwarding through hours of joggers and squirrels until I found what I didn't know I'd been looking for. There she was, Evelyn. Not once, not twice, but 5 separate mornings walking up to other people's mailboxes. Not checking, not inspecting, removing envelopes, unfolding them, photographing them with her phone. I sent Martin everything. 2 days later, I got a knock at the door. This time it wasn't the feds, it was a detective from the county sheriff's office. Badge, gun, and a real sense of purpose. You Trevor Nolan? Yeah, you guys coordinating with the postal inspectors, he nodded. They passed your file to us. We confirmed multiple incidents of mail theft. But this goes deeper. The HOA's financials are a mess. I stepped aside and let him in. He pulled out a tablet and showed me a spreadsheet. There's a trail of unauthorized expenses tied to Evelyn's approval code, thousands spent on community improvements that don't exist. A gazebo that was never built. Landscaping billed 3 times over for the same patch of grass. We're talking embezzlement. You're kidding. Not even close. We're compiling a case now. You're one of several witnesses. We'll need a formal statement. By the time he left, I had a new understanding of just how tangled this got. Evelyn hadn't just been power-hungry, she'd been robbing the entire neighborhood blind while using fake violations to distract everyone. That weekend, the HOA called an emergency town hall in the community center. It was the first one in over 8 months. Normally, these things were a snooze-fest. This time, the place was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls and people stood in the back. I saw faces I hadn't seen in months: retirees, young families, even the guy with the novelty Canon mailbox who usually kept to himself. Martin stood at the podium, face pale but composed. I won't sugarcoat this, he began. We've uncovered serious misconduct by a board member. Funds have been misused, rules were selectively enforced, and in some cases criminal activity occurred. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He raised a hand. We've hired a forensic accountant. We'll be reviewing every transaction from the last 3 years. Any misappropriated funds will be pursued through legal channels. Someone near the back called out, "What about our dues?" Martin looked out over the room. "If we recover the money, it'll go back to the neighborhood. If we don't, well, we'll cross that bridge, but no more blind trust. From now on, all spending will be posted publicly." He stepped aside and the county detective took his place. He didn't give a speech, just laid out the facts: multiple counts of mail theft, fraud, and obstruction. Evelyn was officially under criminal investigation. There would be charges. Real ones. The room was quiet when he finished, not shocked, just processing. Then, from somewhere near the front, a woman asked, "How did this go on so long?" That's when I stood up. She kept us distracted. Petty fines, empty threats, nitpicking nonsense. She made us feel like we were the problem. Heads nodded all around. But the second you push back, I continued, the whole act falls apart. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she was using it. When I sat down, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The mailbox that had once been Evelyn's pride and joy, painted gold, with a tiny eagle perched on top, was gone. In its place was a standard black box. No frills, no messages, no authority. By the following week, her house was up for sale. No open house, no signs, just a quiet listing and a moving truck that arrived before sunrise. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. I only knew she was gone because I watched her drive away from behind my blinds. Something changed after that. The neighborhood felt lighter, more honest. People started talking to each other again, sharing stories about the absurd things they'd been fined for, the guy who got written up for his Halloween decorations lasting an extra day, the woman who got a warning because her hose was too visible from the street. Turns out, nearly everyone had a story. But no one had ever thought to compare notes before. She'd kept us isolated, convinced we were alone in being targeted. That changed fast. Martin organized a committee not to replace the HOA but to oversee it. A rotating group of residents, open sessions, transparent votes. The bylaws were rewritten from scratch. This time by the people who actually lived here. I joined, partly out of spite, mostly out of principle. And at our first meeting, we passed a motion to install public cameras at the community board and mailbox station. Not for surveillance, just accountability. No one objected. And the best part? The garden gnome came back. Right where he belonged. 3 weeks after Evelyn Oakley disappeared from the neighborhood like a stain scrubbed clean, I was called into the county courthouse for a pre-trial deposition. A subpoena arrived folded in a plain manila envelope, hand-delivered by a deputy with a clipboard and a tired expression. He didn't say much, just confirmed my name and handed it over like it was a grocery list. Inside the courthouse, everything was beige walls, tiles, even the clerk's outfit. I sat across from a county prosecutor named Dana Hargrave, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice like clipped wire. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Nolan, you're one of the primary complainants tied to the case involving Evelyn Oakley," she said, tapping her pen against a yellow legal pad. "You submitted video footage, correspondence, and a witness statement. I need to go over a few things before the preliminary hearing." She slid a photo across the table. It showed Evelyn in her driveway, phone in one hand, a stack of opened envelopes in the other. "Do you recognize this?" I nodded. "That's from the footage I submitted." July 3rd, just before 6 in the morning. She hit 3 mailboxes that day. Mine was the last. Dana flipped the photo over and scribbled a note. "Our forensic techs matched the image metadata. We've got timestamps, GPS data from her phone, and a pattern of behavior going back 2 years. It's not just theft, it's premeditated surveillance of private communications." I leaned back. "You're saying she was running a neighborhood spy ring?" "She wasn't just opening mail to find lawn violations, Mr. Nolan," Dana said, meeting my eyes. "She was targeting specific people, mostly those who challenged her authority at HOA meetings or refused to comply with arbitrary fines. We have emails she sent to the HOA board discussing problem residents and how to gather leverage." I felt my jaw tighten. "So this was never about mailbox color or garden decorations." Dana shook her head. "It was about control, and unfortunately it goes deeper." She reached for another folder and opened it slowly. Inside were bank statements, HOA financials, and something that made my stomach twist, a document with my name on it. "This is a fake violation notice you allegedly received in September of last year," she said. According to financial records, the inspection was billed to the HOA under a third-party contractor called Everguard Compliance Solutions. "I remember that notice," I said. "I was fined $200 for having a non-regulation trash bin, even though it was city-issued." Dana nodded. "Everguard doesn't exist. It's a shell company Evelyn created with her nephew. HOA funds were funneled into it and then withdrawn under the guise of enforcement expenses." My stomach dropped. "How much?" "Preliminary estimate, just under $92,000 over 4 years. I whistled under my breath. "The mail tampering is just the start," Dana continued. "We're charging her with wire fraud, embezzlement, falsifying municipal documents, and unlawful surveillance." I couldn't help but ask, "And the rest of the board, did they know?" Dana closed the folder. "That's what we're sorting now." Some of them signed off on expenses without verifying anything. If we find they were complicit, they'll face charges too. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I wasn't required to attend, but I went anyway. The courtroom was bright, sterile, and crowded. Evelyn sat at the defense table in a gray blazer a few shades darker than her complexion. Her once perfect hair looked flat, and her hands clutched a stack of papers that never left her lap. Her attorney, a man with a voice like damp cardboard, argued that the charges were exaggerated, that Evelyn had acted in the community's best interest. Dana eviscerated him. She fabricated contractors to siphon funds. She opened private mail to dig up personal information. She created a culture of fear and compliance, not order. This was not a misguided attempt at community management, it was manipulation and theft. When the judge denied her bail, Evelyn's shoulders collapsed inward like a folding chair. After the hearing, I walked out into the parking lot to find a few of my neighbors gathered near the flagpole. "How bad was it?" asked Reggie from down the street, a retired firefighter who used to get citations for his American flag being too large. "They're throwing the book at her," I said, "and then some." June, who ran a daycare out of her home, crossed her arms. "I hope they audit the whole board. I never saw a receipt for the new playground equipment. Supposedly cost 15 grand. It's 3 swings and a bench." That sparked something. "Martin mentioned an audit," I said. "We need to push it further, not just an internal review. A full community-run audit. Every dollar, every vote, every contract." By the end of the week, we had a volunteer task force assembled. 7 neighbors with various backgrounds: an accountant, a school administrator, a nurse, a former city planner, and even a data analyst who worked from home but apparently hated Evelyn more than anyone. We called ourselves the Transparency Committee. We started by requesting 3 years' worth of HOA financials, which under state law the board was obligated to provide. When the interim treasurer hesitated, we cited the statute and gave him 72 hours. The documents arrived the next day. And they were a disaster. Duplicate invoices, missing vendor names, payments for services that didn't exist. There was a $10,000 invoice for a fence repair that never happened. A landscaping contract for native flora restoration billed monthly, even though the yard in question was a gravel patch behind the tennis court. We compiled everything into a report and handed it off to the county DA's office. Within another week, subpoenas were issued to the former treasurer, the secretary, and Evelyn's nephew. The fallout was swift. 3 former board members agreed to a plea deal in exchange for testimony. Evelyn's nephew was arrested at a gas station trying to withdraw $5,000 from one of the Shell accounts. The DA confirmed that over $120,000 had been stolen or misused, but that wasn't the end. The city council took notice. Turns out, our HOA had been flagged before 3 years earlier during a routine audit of suburban HOAs that never got followed up on due to budget cuts. Our case reignited that effort. The city passed a new ordinance requiring all HOAs to submit quarterly financial reports for public review. A new hotline was created for anonymous complaints, and our neighborhood? We became the model case study. Reporters came by. One of them did a segment titled "From Garden Gnomes to Grand Larceny." I almost choked on my coffee when I saw it. Martin eventually stepped down once the new elections were held. He said he never wanted the job to begin with, and he was only keeping the seat warm until someone more qualified stepped up. We voted in a completely new board, people who actually lived here, had regular jobs, and didn't see bylaws as weapons. As for me, I didn't run for anything. But I stayed on the Transparency Committee. Every quarter, we meet in the rec center with spreadsheets, receipts, and a potluck table. People actually show up now. They bring food, bring questions, bring ideas. Last week, someone even proposed turning the old HOA office into a community library. We voted yes, and the mailbox, The one Evelyn used to patrol like a hawk, it's still there. But now it's wrapped in a mural. A painted garden gnome stands in front of it, watering a lawn flamingo beside a wind chime. No one touches it, not out of fear, out of respect, because the neighborhood finally belongs to the people who live in it. The first time I saw Evelyn in Court Orange, I was standing outside the county courthouse waiting to be called inside for witness prep. She was being led through the side entrance, wrists cuffed, eyes forward, flanked by 2 deputies. Her lawyer trailed behind, his briefcase swinging low like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the small group of onlookers gathered near the security checkpoint, not even when someone muttered, "That's her." By then, the charges had ballooned. What started with federal mail tampering had grown into a multi-agency investigation involving county auditors, postal inspectors, and the state attorney general's office. Every time they peeled back a layer, something worse was underneath. The fraud, the embezzlement, the surveillance, it had all come to light. But what sealed her fate wasn't just the money, it was the extortion. The state dug up a series of recorded phone calls Evelyn had made to a private investigator 4 months before she was caught. She'd hired him paid in cash, using funds siphoned through one of her shell companies to track a neighbor who'd been pushing for a vote to dissolve the HOA. She wanted dirt, anything she could use to discredit him before the vote went public. "You find something with teeth," she'd said on one recording, "and I'll make sure you're paid twice what we agreed. I need leverage before next month." The PI, apparently worried he was being set up, had recorded the whole thing and kept copies. When the state agents swept his office, he'd been under investigation for unrelated tax issues. They found Evelyn's folder. Photos, notes, a printed HOA roster with checkmarks beside certain names. That's what turned the case from fraud to criminal conspiracy. After that, the charges came fast. Unlawful surveillance, misuse of public funds, intimidation of witnesses, and tampering with evidence. She was denied bail a second time after the state proved she'd attempted to delete digital files from a shared HOA server files she didn't know Martin had already mirrored to a private drive. I was called as a witness for the federal side of the case. The charge for mail tampering was still under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and they weren't letting it slide. It was one of the few crimes that didn't get lost in paperwork. They had me walk them through the footage again, this time in a sealed interview room with a federal prosecutor and an evidence technician present. I answered every question, signed the transcripts, and confirmed the chain of custody for the footage. "You're the reason this whole thing cracked open," the prosecutor told me afterward. "Most people just throw that stuff away or chalk it up to neighborhood drama. You documented everything. Good instinct." It wasn't instinct, really. Just a habit I picked up after a stint in the Army. Document everything, question everything twice. The trial started 2 months later. It was a joint prosecution, federal and state working together. The courtroom was packed. Local news stations had set up outside, and the gallery was filled with neighbors, journalists, and more than a few city officials who now had a personal interest in how deep the corruption went. Martin was there too, seated in the front row with a notepad and a pen, even though he wasn't testifying. He told me later he just wanted to see it through. The prosecution built their case with surgical precision. They started with the mail tampering, laying out the sequence, the footage, the timeline. Then they moved into the financials, testimony from forensic accountants, screenshots of bank transfers, fake vendor lists. But the real moment came when they played the audio from Evelyn's call with the private investigator. You could hear her voice clearly, clipped and cold. "I don't care how you get it. I just need something I can use. A Dewey, a bankruptcy, something. People don't vote with a scandal hanging over them." The courtroom was silent except for the recording. When it ended, the prosecutor turned to the jury. "This is not the voice of someone concerned about community standards. This is the voice of someone obsessed with control." Someone who used public trust as a weapon. She didn't just break the rules, she manufactured them to serve herself. Evelyn's defense tried to argue that she was under stress, that she'd been overburdened, that she'd delegated too much. But none of it held. Especially not when her own emails, recovered from the HOA's servers, showed her instructing board members to create compliance issues for residents who failed to vote her way in previous elections. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge handed down the sentence a week later. 12 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 8. Restitution ordered in full. Every dollar traced through the shell accounts was to be returned, with additional fines for the intimidation and surveillance charges. But the restitution wouldn't come from Evelyn directly. The state had already seized her assets, her house, the accounts under her name, even the equity in her late husband's business. Most of it would trickle back through a claims process handled by the new HOA board, who'd set up a special restitution fund for residents who'd been fined or overcharged during her reign. Martin, for his part, declined to return to any leadership role. He nominated a new treasurer, a retired school principal named Deanne, who once threatened to sue the previous board for citing her over a wheelchair ramp. Deanne didn't smile much, but she had a background in compliance law and a zero-tolerance policy for nonsense. The HOA's bylaws were rewritten again, this time with oversight from a city planning attorney and a public notary. Term limits were established. Every board vote going forward had to be recorded and made publicly available. A third-party audit was scheduled annually at the board's expense, not the residents'. The neighborhood changed in subtler ways too. People started planting again not just flowers, but vegetables, fruit trees, even native grass patches. The once uniform, sterile yards began to reflect the people living in them. The silence that used to hang over the block like fog was gone, replaced with laughter, music, conversation. The mailbox Evelyn once violated became a symbol, not of what she did, but of what we did after. Someone added a bronze plaque to it, mounted on a small stone at the base. It read, "In honor of accountability and the courage to speak." It wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about remembering that power only works when people agree to stay silent, and we weren't silent anymore. I still kept my cameras, not out of paranoia but principle. Transparency wasn't just something we demanded from the board. It was something we practiced ourselves. The last time I saw Evelyn was in a news segment 6 months into her sentence. She looked older, thinner, and not just because of the uniform. She was giving an interview from prison, claiming she'd been misunderstood, that her intentions had always been good. But intentions don't open someone else's mail. They don't siphon public funds. They don't hire investigators to dig up dirt on neighbors trying to vote. Good intentions don't leave paper trails of lies. And no matter how polished her words were in that interview, nothing could change what we'd lived through, what we'd uncovered, what we'd fixed. The HOA was no longer a weapon. It was a tool we wielded together, not over each other, and that made all the difference.